Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Jon, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me back on, mate. Your podcast was the highlight of my podcasting efforts around my last book. So I really enjoyed that conversation and very, very glad to be back.
It was a rich conversation. We will link to it in the show notes. And that's one of the things in the time that we've had together, I always find that the waters run deep and your thoughts really challenge me. And it's just good to have you back. So I want to start here. Here we are. We're recording this in the summer of 2020. You are right in the heart of Manhattan, New York City, and right at the heart of COVID in the United States. And I believe your entire family was infected with COVID. So I wanted to start with just this, how has this impacted you? I want to hear a report from the heart of New York City on this crazy 2020 we're having.
Yeah, man. I was in Hawaii at a YWAM event. And at the start of the week, it was like, I think COVID's going to go a little bit nuts. And by Thursday, I was changing my flight to get back. And then I think I got COVID that Sunday at our live filming that Sunday. So a ton of folks got sick as a result of that.
Was that in New York that you think you contracted it?
Yeah, that was in New York on 45th Street.
So you were doing live worship services.
Live worship. I think someone in that room had it.
Really? And so this would be, because we all know the dates, that would be like the first weekend of March, like March 9th or so?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And I basically went out for dinner 2 days later and just felt slightly off and had a sore throat, and then woke up at 2 a.m. and felt like I was dying. It was so visceral and immediate. I remember thinking, I was trying to do audio voice notes to my kids if I died. It was that real in my mind.
So it was that acute. It was that sharp. You're like, I'm not feeling great to this might be it.
Yes, I thought I am dying. And woke up at 2 a.m, felt like I was being run over, not hit by a truck, being run over by it. And about 48 hours later, it sort of lifted. And then it took me about another 10 days to, get to about 80% health. And then, however, we're probably 3 months on the other side of that. I'm basically back, but I do notice some issues with my lungs. My kids basically both slept in a couple of days in a row, and that was all they experienced. My daughter said, I have a headache, I'm taking a nap, and that was her experience of COVID. My son slept for 16 hours and was like, I think I'm done with COVID. My wife got it after me, and she was in bed for a month solid, like she was dying. It was horrific, and all the advice was don't go to the hospitals because I was just worried about overcrowding. So that they said, unless you cannot breathe. And so there was a couple of times we were like, I think we just need to go in. And
so you didn't go to the hospital, or did you?
No, she went to the hospital after the COVID flattened. And because she ended up getting bilateral pneumonia, and then they thought she had blood clots on her lungs. It was all super hairy. And so she did go into the hospital for that, but they basically sent her home and said, take these medications. There's not a whole lot more we can do if it gets worse in a week. And that was, 30-something days, and it turned around. And then she's now at about 90%. She's not fully back, but she's doing a lot better. So.
And you are pre-existing, relatively healthy, under 50 adults who lead an active lifestyle.
Yeah. I'm like an out of shape rugby player, but I'm super active. I probably in a typical day walk 7.5 miles. So today I've done 6 miles or whatever. So it's pretty active. and we just got hit by it. So it was.
Were you tested for COVID, or like you're assuming it was COVID?
No, whole family. Yep, whole family was tested. We all have confirmed antibodies, and
so that's the only positive going forward.
But it's like a New York badge of honor in some sense. Someone said to me, "Put it on your resume." So the whole family got COVID and survived 2020. But I say that lightheartedly, but there was a lot of people in tremendous trauma, and some of my closest friends were healthcare workers, and I think they have and will have ongoing PTSD. I think that what they saw, they're in trauma, and they still don't have the space. They're just now coming out of like the adrenaline phase and trying to, turn their brains off and unsee some of the things they've seen. So I think the fallout's going to be a lot longer and a lot harder than a lot of people anticipate.
What did that do to you emotionally to be that sick? And to have your wife and your kids, it was relatively mild, but your wife that impacted for that long. What did that do to you? Because you're trying to lead a church and pivot a church, like right in the midst of all that.
Yeah, I'm still preaching every Sunday. So I preached.
So you preached through COVID?
Yeah, man. So I literally got up, gave the talk, had shorts and a t-shirt on, put a blazer on, gave the talk, went back to bed and crashed. Because I felt like it was so important. Our church was like going through this cultural shock and transition. I didn't want to put someone else up. What did it do? Oh, man. I mean, it just made me aware of eternity, mortality, vulnerability, fragility. It was so humbling. We are just little mortal beings. Our life is but a breath. All of those things were so real, That's basically what it was. It was like living with a level of awareness of mortality.
It's so weird, just to reflect a little bit because we're months out now. But I remember in those first few days, and I did not, there's a part of me that thinks I got COVID because I was in New York 2 weeks prior to that. I was in Atlanta in early March. I was all over the US. Yeah. And then I had a couple of days where it was more like your kids, where I just kind of thought, oh, am I okay? And then I was fine. I'm like, oh, I hope that was COVID, but like I have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
But, shy of that, scripture was popping in a way it hadn't popped in years, even though I read it regularly. And it's like everything was so abnormal and your routine was so fragile. Even like you and I were talking before we started recording, speaking career wiped out, gone in a heartbeat. And then you're like, well, what am I going to do? And what does my life look like now? And yet now we've managed to find some semblance of normal. And so many leaders are running back to normal, even if they shouldn't. Any thoughts on that? One of the things I love about it is you always think so deeply about these things.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you could slice it. Sociologically, geographically, theologically. There's so many responses people have. And then even in theologically is like, how sovereign is God in this? Is he like meticulously sovereign where he personally oversaw the exact transmission of the virus to the specific people he wanted it to? Did he want this to happen as a form of judgment? Was this something he allowed? I mean, so there's a lot to unpack there. I'm not a 5-point Calvinist. I don't believe in meticulous sovereignty. So I'm more in the God using it, allowing it framework. The thing that I think is so sad, I mean, there's so many ways I could respond, but I think the thing that's so sad is I feel like we didn't in our quest for normalcy, we didn't learn any of the great lessons we needed to learn. I feel like as a whole, we missed them. This could have been an absolute revolution. And everybody was like, is this the beginning of a move of God? Look how many people are crying out to God. And I was like, God is so gracious. He will respond to panic prayers. And he often sends things to get us to. But when it all just sort of like, okay, I think we're going to be okay, all those 24/7 prayer meetings just faded off, and all the big efforts just sort of drifted back to, and then the question became, how soon can we reopen? Rather than, I looked at a lot of your stuff. You were one of the reference points I was checking in on, no, this is a digital moment. So there's shifts that are happening here that we will never go back from. We will never return to normal. We will go back to live gatherings and doing church, but we will never only do that. And so I think it's in some ways sad that we missed some of the big lessons, spiritual lessons. I think New York and cities will be irreparably changed for many, many years. But I think for the most part, the church just, and particularly with all the shifts around racial injustice, it's like COVID, we're in post-COVID now. Whatever COVID was, that turned in 2 days. It was like COVID never happened. And so even trying now to respond to racial injustice and diversity, all those sort of conversations, COVID's just been pushed aside. And even with all the waves coming, like there's a second wave and all that, it seems like it's pretty minimal compared to the urgency around racial justice, particularly here in the United States. So it's a whole nother thing. So whatever was hanging around from COVID sort of disappeared in 2 days around the issue of racial injustice. And again, I think it's the church instinct. We'll be excited for a moment and probably won't have the long game we need. God's always doing these moments of awakening. They're invitations into change. And if we don't set the right habits, practices, vision, values deeply enough in that moment of disruption, we will revert back to the previous thing and miss the opportunity. So,
well, and never... you don't want to make any predictions in 2020 about what this will be like when this airs later in the summer. But as we record this in late June of 2020, you can almost feel a semblance of the racial injustice conversation not proceeding at the intensity that it was even a few weeks ago. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think it should, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need a weather event, and then probably there'll be a terrorist attack, and then the elections are going to, the US election is just going to dominate the global stage because it feels like there's so much at stake. I mean, we can talk about, are we living in a Chinese century? What is the future? But truth be told, in Adelaide, Australia, where I grew up, they are doing protests for George Floyd in Adelaide, Australia. We are still in an American-centric reality. The unjust, horrific death of one man on a street in Minnesota shook the world out of America. And it changed the global conversation in many, many places. So I think the follow-through of that is going to be, will there be change in the White House that carries the current cultural momentum around justice into a political reality? And so it feels like this is going to be a very, very high-stake election. And honestly, if Trump wins, I think the level of not just protest but rioting is going to be just staggering. And it won't be that.
You think it'll be a violent election one way?
Oh yeah. I'm on 45th and 9th in Manhattan, so I'm 2 blocks from Times Square, and I'm almost on a piece of paper in the center of a diagonal line between Trump Plaza and the Javits Center, when that election happened. And my wife actually got stuck in the middle of the Not My President protest trying to get home. And she said there was sort of an energy in the city she'd never encountered that was sort of terrifying, the level of angst. And I think we're definitely going to see that again, regardless of the outcome. I think
I was going to say, I think that could go either way. I mean, whether Trump wins or loses, I'm worried a little for America. As two non-Americans, you living there and me holding a green card and spending, until now, a lot of my life in America, it's really interesting to see this happen. You said something about a terrorist attack and a weather event. I just want to follow that logical chain down. What did you mean by that? I wasn't 100% clear.
No, I mean...
You mean just make 2020 more complicated,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Okay,
You can't make any predictions. It's like something's going to impact whatever moment we're in. It just feels like that's the kind of view.
One of my favorite little single panel cartoons I've seen this year was an asteroid and an alien hovering in the orbit of Earth, and the asteroid saying to the alien, "Oh, are you next? I thought I was next. Okay, you go ahead." And I'm like, yeah, that is 2020. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and you're right. This is a really important conversation on racial justice. However, I want to go back to what you said about normalizing things, because whether that's racial justice or whether that's COVID or whether that's the election, there was something really powerful in what you said about we were just so busy rushing back to normal that we missed the moment that could have been. And to nuance that, I've heard you, Mark Sayers, to a certain extent, our mutual friend David Kinnaman, a little bit Pete Gregg maybe, all say that revival doesn't happen without repentance. And maybe this was a moment that could have been very different, but we were so fixated on reopening the church, getting back to normal, getting back to what we know, the certain versus the uncertain, even if we had to force it. Did we miss a moment here?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we missed the moment, mate. I'm pretty sure. I go back to, I read an article. It was called "The Coronavirus Experiment," and it's my one takeaway from COVID that I have. It's my one core practice I've stayed on, and it was written about a missionary named James O. Fraser, who was a missionary up in the mountains of China. And he basically did this experiment in total obscurity. There's a book written by his daughter, I think, called Mountain Rain. I very highly recommend it. Very inspiring account. He basically did an experiment. The weather was so bad. There was, I think it's the Lasou people that he was working with. He was stopped from seeing them in the winter because he just couldn't travel up to them. And so he said, "I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to minister in person to the people I can get to. And then I'm going to devote prayer to the people I can't reach. And at the end of the season, when we all gather again as a community, I'm going to see the spiritual growth of everybody." And he said he found that the people that he had interceded for experienced dramatically deeper growth than those he was personally doing ministry with. Deeper love for the word of God, more holiness. They'd taken ground spiritually. And so the thing was called the Coronavirus Experiment. And so I said, the one thing I'm going to do in the COVID season is increase the level of intercession in my life. And I'm just going to do an experiment. Will we emerge out of this a more godly, powerful church with authority, humility? And so I've just pushed into that. I've called our church to that sort of ad nauseum. But I'm amazed at how many people were like, yeah. And then it just dissipated. It just sort of dissipated back to, I said, shame on us if 50 years from now, when our grandchildren ask us, what did you do in the coronavirus? And all you can do is tell them the list out the shows you watched on Netflix, and that's what COVID amounted to you. And I think tragically, a lot of it happened. My favorite little cartoon, this is going back a little while now. My favorite cartoon was somebody saying next to President Trump, which is like, "The virus is here. What do we do?" And he said, "Release that Tiger documentary." Because it's just, it's collective attention span. So one of the things that's so fascinating that I've observed in this, which is why I think we sort of missed a moment, before all the cable TV shows, when there was 3 or 4 television channels and everybody sort of observed cultural voices that helped us navigate through these moments. And then America fractured into screens and hundreds of channels and YouTube and all the rest of it. It feels like the whole world sort of rallied again around 4 or 5 voices. And all of those voices were secular and scientific. None of them were religious. And so we were there was no talk. I mean, almost no talk about the end times or the judgment of God. You consider 2011 and Graham Lotz. How could God let this happen? Well, you've kicked him out of education. He's taken his hand of blessing off you. There was none of that in any media. And so I feel like the Christian's attention span, because of the guiding voices, 4 or 5 guiding voices, were all about science and protection and normalization and fear. We got our eyes off God. And so with those voices saying the goal is reopen, everybody said, I guess that's the goal, reopen. Yeah. Christians also, once you know what a community fears, they're so easy to manipulate. And Christians fear being uncompassionate. Like, we do not want to be uncompassionate. We do not want to be seen as selfish. So anytime someone says doing this is selfish, we're like, we'll stop then. And so I think, again, all of the tensions about meeting in person and, opening the economy, like, these were all distractions from Jesus, who was like, I'm knocking at the door of the church, asking you to let me back in. And I don't think we heard the knock, mate. I don't think we heard and opened. Or we open the door and we're like, be right back, Jesus. Like, come in. I've got a few things I'm going to take care of. I'm not trying to dismiss what we had to navigate and wrestle through, but I do think we missed that moment.
I would love you to replay it then. So if you could replay from the second week of March through to the summer of 2020, and in your mind, the church didn't miss the moment, we seized it, what would it have looked at? What would it have looked like for us to have seized the moment? What would have been different? What would we have done differently?
I think there would have been more. There were some good united prayer moments, but they never got through to. They never got sort of through to breakthrough level prayer. And I'm not trying to paint some sort of like Gnostic levels of spiritual authority and power, those sorts of things. But there's kind of a desperation. There's kind of a desperate prayer, like one author called the power of crying out. That with your children, they have different cries. There's sort of like the whine, and then there's they're looking for you and they're yelling. But there's that like, oh gosh, they didn't breathe for 3 seconds because they're inhaling to burst their lungs. And that cry moves you, and you would drop everything.
You know, it's not a faint cry. We're coming. Right. Yep.
So I think we never got to that level of desperation, and so I would have stayed on deep internal examination about the church's failures and self-reliance. And so what are we being stripped of? All of the false things that we relied on. Therefore, in the stripping, let's turn our hearts back to God now. You know, I think sort of what happened with Jehoshaphat. You know, he's surrounded by a force he can't control. He calls the people to fast and pray. They come and appear before the Lord, even infants in mother's arms. They appear before the Lord and they say, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And so I think we didn't quite get there collectively. We got drawn into debate instead of intercession. And so I wish some Christian leaders had risen up and given spiritual direction to call the national church to repentance and introspection. So, you know, instead of the 4 or 5 medical verses and scientists, it would have been Christian leaders giving advice and calling for united prayer. And some of this did happen on a local level, but we never took that start into the next level, which I think would have been churches doing deep examination and repentance, and maybe the Black Lives Matter stuff is another jolt of God for the church to have a moment of examination and repentance. You know, so like, let me show you something you really got wrong. And then it's like, if we're not willing to walk into that, like what is left?
What's
for
left?
God to get our attention? I'm scared at the thought.
No, I'm just thinking through even the prayer as I participated in my own prayer life, and you know, watching the general prayer collective, so to speak. And I think you're right; it abated quickly. I also wondered, John, if a lot of our prayer was for protection and return to normalcy. You know, if you really look back at that,
right.
Yeah,
exactly
it was like,
right.
Lord, heal our land. It was, Lord, make the virus go away. It was, Lord, let us reopen our buildings for Easter. Whoops, summer. Whoops, as soon as possible. Yeah. And, you know, with that, you know, what are you going to tell your grandkids one day about what you did in coronavirus? I think too often the answer is, I just went back to whatever was safe and normal and what I knew, and I tried to pick up where I left off.
Yeah. Yeah,
I wonder if that's the narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, the fundamental flaw is we got our eyes off God.
Yeah.
That's the root of it. Like we wanted God to fix things and to respond to things, none of which are necessarily wrong. You cry out when you have needs, but we got our eyes off God and we got onto solutions rather than letting God tell us what the solutions He wanted to be were. And so, look, I'm not hopeless about it. I'm just saying that really could have been something. That really could have been something.
So for those who would still be in the place going, okay, at the moment I'm hearing this, you know, the best time to plant a tree is 25 years ago. Second best time is today. Can there still be redemption, or did this ship sail? Did we miss it? Like, can there still be, or you're like, nah, we missed our collective moment? I'm curious what you think.
I mean, only God knows that. God is so merciful. We're always invited in. I preached to our church on Sunday. There's that verse where God says to his people, I looked for a man to stand in the gap for the land, and to build up the wall, but I found none. And it's like God sadly says, and I sound all like super prophetic, which is not my like default tone. He said, therefore I will have to pour out on them my anger and pay to them according to what they've done. And I was like, God is almost like so sad that he's not asking for everybody. He's just looking for a few. And he's like, I couldn't even find a few. And so we can always press in, and we may not see some sort of national change of attention, but you could certainly see it in your church and in your region and certainly in the culture of your life. So it's just turning back to the Lord with all of our hearts.
A couple of things that really surprised me, having not been through a year like this before in my life, was I was surprised at the rapid advance of two things. Number one, denial. Just like, this virus isn't real, it's a hoax, it's all, everything from that kind of extreme view to, I'm sure we all have immunity somehow, that this isn't really a big deal, and I can go shopping and I don't have to wear a mask. And listen, I don't like masks either, but I get it. So there's that sort of denial thing. I've been talking about the new normal, and I can't tell you, almost every single day on social media, someone's like, would you stop with this new normal thing? And I'm like, all right. But the other thing is not in my backyard. So you being at the epicenter of the disease outbreak in the early stages in America, heart of Manhattan, New York City, I couldn't believe the number of leaders who are like, oh, well, I'm in the Midwest, so that doesn't really impact me at all. And like all that distancing and like, that's like another country over there, and we're okay over here. And I'm just wondering for your take on that, like the denial and the not in my backyard, or that's not my reality, or that's not my context. And over here, we're just fine. Any thoughts on what that is? It's been really fascinating to see.
That is a broken and a fractured nation. That's what that is. So, part of the disdain for church. So we're just dealing at a time of totalizing narratives. You cannot concede ground. You cannot concede ground in any way, shape, or form. So if you were to say, unless you say Trump, and so I'm in a super liberal city, New York, okay? It'd be very, very different if I was in maybe somewhere like Mississippi or whatever. But you say something like, you say Trump, if you don't slur that with disdain, people will write you off. I've never seen, so I've been a pastor for 20 plus years, 15 in Manhattan, and I've never seen people leave the church over any issue, including sexuality or anything, more than I have over politics. Politics, the division of politics is so deep. I think part of that is because we're truly secular now, which means there's no afterlife. So you have to cram an eternity's worth of justice or happiness into now. So for people, if you believe this is all there is, like the level of eternal angst projected into a moment is so high. And so things like patience and nuance are just not virtues that work with such a short reference point of life. And I think if Trump, and by the way, no one's trying to tell the truth. Everybody's trying to leverage power and maintain political benefit. So you're not getting like filtered data. I mean, you know how easy it is to manipulate statistics.
Yeah.
And so if like Trump says something, you're like, liberals are like, well, I bet he spun that. If Trump says it's not that serious, everybody immediately says, well, it's not that serious then because it's just the liberals trying to attack Trump. It's just a cycle of attack. And I think that's that, and selfishness as well, with a little bit of selfishness thrown in. So it's like, not my people, not my problem. You know what, New York, I hope the whole thing goes down.
Yeah. That was a very real thing that I heard. Not quite as that stark, but that sentiment is that's just New York. And so you hinted at something, and I just want to throw this out there because I saw this. Like when I was in seminary, I thought that there's a faction of the church that has become what I would call the secular church. It had basically become humanistic self-help, devalued scripture, questioned the divinity of Jesus, questioned, and really became, the forerunner of some of the things that we see today. But I wonder, to a certain extent, do you think the evangelical church has become secularized as well?
I wouldn't say it's become secular there's certainly elements of deconstruction really working in the church. I think it's become overly pragmatic. So if secular doesn't mean, like using, again, Taylor's phrase, Christianity holds a non-privileged position in the cultural square. I think the vast thing people are doing is they're just pragmatic. They're not God-centered, so everything is like rush to application. And I think that's become a large part of it. So yeah, there definitely is the tension between secular humanism with religious garb, which is what you talked about in seminary, and the evangelical rush to application. What both of those things miss is God. God himself. And so I think part of that is the real problem.
Well, it's been super helpful, and thanks for sharing personally and also the deeper cultural narrative, which I think is so needed, and I'm so encouraged to see it in younger leaders like yourself, having lost a few giants in the church in the last decade. Eugene Peterson, Dallas Willard, recently Ravi Zacharias. It's like, oh gosh, like we need thinkers, and we need people with a heart for God, and I see that in you, Jon, just to affirm that, and so
thanks, mate.
Appreciate that and value it. Let's talk about your church, because as of recording this, late June 2020, you are not yet publicly reopened for physical gatherings. Yep. What has this been? And probably actually the majority of churches in America aren't, as much as the narrative seems like it is. The stats are showing that's not true. In my own country, in Canada, the small churches are reopening, but we're going to stay closed for a while. For practical reasons, maybe not theological, but like it's going to be super awkward for a long time. What has this done to Church of the City in New York, and how are you navigating this season of being online only?
It's so funny because at the start of COVID, I was like in total heartbreak lament, and part of it was we had been leaning in so heavily with like all the urgency I had to seeking God for spiritual awakening. It was actually a conversation with David Kinnaman that like really shook me. He basically said, bar a genuine move of God and radical discipleship, statistically, we've lost the church. We can't get it back by human means. And that just sort of shook me to the core. And that was a part of like what made me do that, the stuff with my son, the how to be a better dad stuff. And then the other part was like, we just got to press in for prayer. And I've talked about this concept quite a bit, but it's like in sports, the clock determines the play. So, to try and, I'm going to mangle this, I can tell already, but to use hockey as an example.
I don't know sports very well, so we'll just, we'll just let people leave comments, okay, and write in. So go ahead, Jon.
So if you're in the Stanley Cup and, which is probably again American hockey. Gosh, I'm just failing. I fail.
No, it is. Canadians would hold that very dear and sacred.
Okay, so in the first moments of the game, you're urgent, but you're excited, but you're patient because you got time. But if you're down by a goal in the last minute, you're going to pull the goal. Yeah, you're going to push. It's just the urgency. The clock determines the play. Like the final minutes, scoreboard, you got to go in. And I just had this sense. This is a moment for radically seeking God. And I was trying to think a little upstream, right, which is like, how do we get ahead of a divided church with the election this year? Let's just press it to seek God. And mate, I'm telling you, we had so much momentum, spiritual momentum in our church. Altars filled with people weeping, seeking God. I mean, like it felt like the breath of God was on us. And then the next week it was like, welcome to online worship. And we were not good at it. I felt disillusioned and disheartened by that in the first week. And now, several months in, so I was preaching 5 times on Sundays, 5 services, 3 locations. I mean, it was a very, very large workload. And now I really like where we are. I would be happier if we could get small groups going in homes, which we can't do and won't be able to do this summer. So what it's done to our church is I'm super proud of how our church has pivoted. We've had, our giving has not gone down. In fact, it's gone up. People have been very, very generous. We did a church survey. 30% of our church left New York. Left the city.
Is a thing, right? I had that on my question list, deurbanization. But so 30% of your church just went elsewhere.
Yeah, but the almost all of them plan to come back when possible, out of not just work, but a sense of commitment to the city. We're this is the greatest opportunity in our lifetime for two things: to buy real estate, and it's the greatest opportunity to repair the reputation of the church by being in the middle of brokenness. This is our Nehemiah moment. So our church has really bought into that vision, but it's been very awkward. Our team's done a great job. Our groups have done very, very well. We've offered courses that have been very well attended. We found a sustainable rhythm for online worship, and we will never not have online again. Online is a part of us.
How much was that a part of your a strategy prior to COVID?
Oh, absolutely zero. He had no strategy.
You were totally in person, organic,
Yeah, and we would film the gatherings and put them online. We have our podcast is probably 10x our attendance on a Sunday. So we have a good podcast listenership. I have a leadership coach who was pushing me saying, your church is bigger than just who's showing up on Sunday. There's people who are responding to your sort of combination of cultural engagement, charismatic bent with sort of biblical thoughtfulness. And he said, you've got to figure out how to serve these people. And so we had that floating around in our head. But the other factor that's made us take this really seriously is we have people that are New York exiles. They've lost their jobs. They can't come back. They won't be back, but they feel like they're a part of us. And so how do we love them and serve them? So I'll be honest with you, I did possess a little bit of a online consumer mentality. People online, it's just consumers. They go to multiple churches. And I'm not saying that's not there. That's just not my lens anymore. It's an unhelpful lens. You can even control that.
Right.
You can even control that. The only way to control it is to password protect your site and make people who come live access it. And to me, it's that's pedantic. We're trying to spread the gospel. So that's basically, we pivoted. I'm pretty happy with how it's gone. I'm just genuinely pastorally thrilled with our people's hearts. There's a scene in the book of Acts where the Apostle Paul, there's a riot in the city of Ephesus, and the whole city is chanting for 2 hours, "Long live Artemis of the Ephesians."
Yeah.
And it says they had to physically restrain the Apostle Paul from going in there to preach to them. And I have this talk for our church called Let Me In There. What kind of belief do you have to have in the gospel that you're this is I've got them all in one place. Let me in there. I believe the gospel can shake this city. And so I said, I want to be a let me in there disciple, and I want to have a let me in there church. And I'm so pleased that most people's efforts has been let me in to the brokenness of New York to rebuild whatever it looks like after that. So the core is solid. There's been a breathtaking emphasis on prayer. That we actually had built a very, very strong prayer ministry before this. It transitioned online, and that's the best thing that's ever happened to us.
How have you done that? How have you brought prayer online?
Just Zoom prayer meetings, man.
Pretty
as simple as that. Yeah. So we would, I don't have the statistics because the person running it is out on paternity leave right now. But so our church had 4 hours of prayer a day in a prayer room happening in person in a prayer room in the middle of New York City. And so all we had to do was click a button, and now people are joining us from around the world. So I would say there's some elements going online that have been disproportionately accelerated. Some elements I'm torn about, some elements that haven't been as good. But overall, it nets out to it's been a very positive experience for us.
What are you
push through
about?
online? Oh, I believe there is something powerful about being in the room with other, like an embodied faith, like taking the sacraments together, being able to lay your hands on someone and pray for them. There's reasons the Bible has small little belonging clues, like greet one another with a holy kiss. And, in Roman society, those very, very small things, normally not done between classes, these were like little symbols that said, this is a new humanity. And I think there's ways you only get that live. I also miss preaching to an audience, but not through a camera. I love the power of the gathered people of God for worship. So, but again, it's a false dichotomy to say it has to be either or. That's what I've lost. I've lost the false dichotomy. You wrote a comment in one of your articles that I had our whole team talk through, which was saying does online count is like saying to a mall, does Amazon count?
Yeah.
And I was like, that's the truth, man. That's the truth. This is God's put this here to extend the reach of the gospel. And as long as personally, as leaders, we are embodying what we're preaching, like we are literally living into the way of Jesus, so that when people get close, they say, this is a real life. That to me is the main thing. So live deeply and share broadly. That's the vision.
Well, it's really interesting too, because someone like you, to a certain extent, like myself or some other guests like John Mark Comer or so on, or even Mark Sayers, we have all experienced what I might call disproportionate influence. In other words, my church isn't the biggest in the country or the biggest in the world, but God's given me a platform for whatever reason that reaches millions of people. And I don't really understand why. You look at, you have global impact through your books and so on, and through the ministry that you've done over the years. And so does some of the others, that we've mentioned, or Ann Graham Lotz, for example, or, there are so many Annie F. Downs who preaches in Nashville.
Yeah.
Just this disproportionate impact. And that happens because of the internet. We don't own TV networks. We don't own radio stations. It's happened because of online and viral. And I don't know why the church shouldn't benefit from that. Like, I just don't know why the gospel can't travel along those same lines. One of the questions I've gotten a lot, which is, I'll just pose it to you. I don't know that there's an easy answer, but I get this every week or so online. Somebody says, what about the theology of all this? Because you're right. I've been the proponent of pay attention online. I'm banging that drum every day, whether people are listening or not. And I get a lot of pushback to it, but people are like, what about the theology of all that? And I'm like, yeah, sometimes the theology just has to catch up. Any thoughts on what is the, and I'm not sure it's fundamentally different, but any thoughts on the theology that would accompany a broader online presence for the church in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you would have to pass it out. I mean, I believe that the church should be an embodied local community under the rule of spiritual authority, church elders, receiving the sacraments on the regular. I mean, that's what I think a local church is. So I'm not advocating getting rid of that at all. But, so then is there, I mean, so I'm thinking of a few verses just sort of off the top of my head. 1 Thessalonians, you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia. The word of the Lord rang out from you. In the Greek, literally means to trumpet, to herald. And so there was something happening with the Thessalonians that the whole region heard about. That's interesting to me. So, when Paul says, your love is known amongst all the churches. I have no need to add anything to it. So what a church carries and embodies can have a reputation that is known around and spills around. And then you think about you get out of the context of church and then you talk about ministry or mission or the preaching of the word or the spreading of the gospel. It's always crossing barriers. In an unauthorized way, some Greek-speaking followers of Jesus went to the city of Antioch. They crossed the boundaries without apostolic authority. And the apostles had to come, and they sent Barnabas to come and see. And it says, when he saw the grace of God, he saw it. And so the gospel is always bigger than the church. It's always crossing boundaries. And as Paul said, the word of God is not chained. It's not chained. You can't chain it up. So there should always be an overflow impact of the message of the gospel and biblical teaching to help other people. When Paul says, once you've read this, send this to the other churches or have them read that too. So there's a desire for shared ministry and shared authority. What are people resisting? That's the question. It's like, why do people push back on it? It doesn't even seem that controversial. Well, I think there's probably a few things. They're resisting consumer Christianity. So they're worried that by taking in extra online content, people will not participate fully in the life of their local church. There's probably some legitimacy to that. But that's not just local church. That's all the information they're taking in that weakens their involvement. They're probably worried about the concept of celebrity pastors. Sometimes that can be insecurity or jealousy. Well, God, I'm better than him. Why not me? Which makes you then impugn people's motives. He must be a narcissist if he can push himself that far out. And then again, I think sometimes people are worried that some of the preachers get popular do seem sort of like they don't have a profoundly deep theology.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Someone like, say, John MacArthur, Grace to You, or Charles Stanley. I'm thinking of the older guys that have been pushing out tape ministries. Chuck Colson. I mean, these not Colson, Swindoll.
Yeah, Chuck Swindoll.
These guys have been sending cassette tapes in the mail. There's always been people who've had larger ministries out of their local church. I think it is the celebrity theological thing that people are resisting right now. That's probably my take.
No, I think that's fair. And I would say under some of the questions, and I don't really know because these aren't long dialogues, but I think theology is an attempt to understand, but it can also be an attempt to control, right? It can also be an attempt to, well, unless you fit my super hyper narrow definition of what is approved and what is not approved, then it can't really work. And I think there's a certain element, like when you talk about even in the book of Acts, I just finished reading Acts chapter 10, and there's a sense in which Peter's world is turned upside down. He gets this vision of the ministry actually going to the Gentiles, which would have been almost complete unfaithfulness to him from his worldview. And then he sees, Gentiles worshiping God, and they have the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he's like, well, I guess I can't really stand in the way of this, can I? And God's already shown me. And there's a certain sense in which I think we're moving into that new era where, and I would just encourage leaders who are listening to reflect on, I know this has been a great, rich conversation so far, and there's much to go, but that drive to go back to normal and to normalize or to revive what was, as opposed to embrace the mystery of what could be or what is, because I think there's a lot of fertile ground there. Any final thoughts on that? And then I want to talk about New York and a bunch of other stuff.
Oh, I mean, gosh, there's so many things that should be unpacked at some point about that. But I think that we've said enough. Get in trouble enough for what's already been said.
Talk about New York. Yeah, I think we've managed to alienate everybody, which is good. Yeah. Talk about New York and rebuilding New York. You're saying that this city will be scarred for many years. Tim Keller, who I had on the show a few months ago, talked about the rebuilding of New York after 9/11 and just how devastating an event that was for the city, not only for the nation, but particularly for the city. COVID, a similar mark on the city. Talk to me about that.
I wasn't there for 9/11. That's actually how I came to love New York. I came up to pray for the city after 9/11. And, everybody who knows me knows my story. I ended up just going for a walk through Times Square and then walking around our neighborhood all night in prayer, seized with a complete vision, like, dear God of the universe, please let me live in New York, please. So I wasn't there for that, but that's how I got there. I was there for 2008. I remember walking through Times Square and seeing people walking out of the Lehman Brothers building with boxes when everyone was getting fired and the whole economy was melting down. So I've got some thoughts on that. I was there for Hurricane Sandy when the city was underwater and absolutely devastated. That was very, very scary. This is different than all of that. And I bet Keller would say this is different. There's a.
I haven't had talked to him since. Talked to him just before.
Those were what felt like one-off events that had an end date that you could say, we're done with it now, let us rebuild together. This thing you can't control like that. You can't get around it. So the permanent sense of fear is much higher. It is hard to articulate. And I think because we've lived in a neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen for the last 6 years, which is basically Midtown West, right off Times Square. And so I'm in one of the most population dense miles on planet Earth on any given day. So I felt it particularly hard. And to see hundreds of thousands of people in Times Square, and then to get up and walk through Times Square and pray and be the only, I do not exaggerate, the only person in Times Square was so disillusioning. There's a lot of things. So I actually was just on a call with a Harvard professor who wrote about pandemics and their impact on cities or whatever. So I just had 2 hours of pure genius. One of the world experts on how that works. And so I'll give you some of the things that he said. So he did like metadata research with all of his resources. He said he thinks 40% of the jobs that converted to basically Zoom jobs will remain that way. 40% of jobs will stay what he called telecommuting jobs. So there definitely will be a lot of people who say, I'll come to New York once a month or one day a week, but I'm not coming in every day. Some people are saying skyscrapers are a thing of the past. The days of,
like the New York Times has been remote, like Times Square. The New York Times has been remote for 4 months. It's crazy.
That's so funny because out of my living room window, I look at the New York Times building, and it's fascinating. It's like I didn't know that, but I always that's like the orientation point of my mornings is looking at that. So yeah, and many companies, like many of the large financial firms have said, I don't think we'll ever be back at full capacity. So one of the things he said that's interesting is that the centers of sort of power and energy and prestige will bounce back because property values are too high. He said, but it's somewhere like some town in Ohio, for example, you're not going to abandon a skyscraper in New York City. Like rents could drop 25% and people will still fill them. People are not going to walk away from property in New York. So there's not going to be like homeless people moving in or whatever he said, but there's going to be other cities that don't have that reputation. Will be like that. So he says he thinks New York's going to fare better than in that deurbanization movement. But much of what we love will not come back soon. Concerts are the last thing that will come back. Broadway, clubs, packed in clubs will not come back. So what people are going to lose, and this is what they're going to lose: culture, access to culture, cultural artifacts and events. And because it's your job, you may be able to do that anywhere, but they're going to lose access to culture, and they're going to lose access to social capital. And if you were to ask people, why are you in New York? A lot of it is because of like the relational scene and energy and the culture I get to participate in. And that stuff's not going to be coming back. So there's going to be some sadness. Many people say it's going to get younger and cheaper. And I hope it gets cheaper. But I will say this. It's the greatest opportunity for followers of Jesus in our lifetime. If you're under the sound of my voice, come and help us in New York. No, it's like, Christians run in when everyone runs out. That's our posture in many ways. And I believe New York will come back. And so people say to me, what's the future of New York? And I'm like, I don't know, but I give you my word, God willing, you will find me up early, walking the streets, praying, loving, serving, trying to shape its future. The only thing I have for the future is a commitment to rebuild the city and to see the church thrive. So I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what the changes are. I just know our people are going to be in the middle of it, trying to pour out their lives to serve it. Now, we don't have to be physically proximate. And I've got friends who have said, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, he goes like, I think we're done with New York, man. We're virtual. We're purely virtual. And I was like, whoa, I feel like famous last words. I feel like I sort of have a land covenant with New York. You know, I love it. I've done a deep reevaluation, which is like, do I need to be here? Am I still called here? If ever there's an excuse to leave New York, it is now.
It's right now.
But I'm like, there's nowhere else I want to be, nothing else I want to do. So I'm just going to dig in and just grind it out. And I was going to say one thing, getting back to, I just taught this at our church on Sunday. Rees Howells, intercessor, the guy from Wales, amazing life and legacy. He was talking about how intercession works, and he talks about identity, agony, and authority. And he's like, you've got to make a conscious choice of who you identify with. There can be surface identification, there can be selfish identification, but then there's sacrificial identification, which is like, your people are now my people. That leads you then to experience the agony. And that ultimately, when people sense that he's one of us and he's paid the price, they'll listen. You've got authority to speak into it. And I've made a conscious decision to identify with the city, and I felt the pains of it in many, many very, very real ways, raising my kids there all the way through school. And now I'm like, I want to be here to help rebuild on the other side of this. And that's going to lay the foundation for whatever God does in the next 20 years. So I'm not thinking, to be honest with you, where's our church going to be in 2 years? I'm like, how are kids who are 2 years old right now, what will they inherit because of our faithfulness in this season? And how do we pass that on to them, build them something so they don't experience the pain of what we have, and they have a foundation for the gospel to thrive into the future.
You have a lot of young leaders listening to this podcast right now. Was that a half serious invitation to like, man, if you ever thought about going to New York, come on in, we need you?
It's even when New York's cheap, it's cripplingly expensive, you know, but it is a serious invitation. I mean, people will be able to get apartments that were prohibitive before. And New York is such a special place, and it's got such a dense history on every block. I mean, I walk around my neighborhood. I go to get coffee and I pass the church where Walter Russienbusch pastored. And on the corner in German, it says Christ the Cornerstone. The whole social gospel was built there. I turn the corner and there's A.B. Simpson's a gospel tabernacle where he launched the Christian Missionary Alliance in the middle of Times Square. Everywhere I look, I'm reminded of something profound. And my heart is like, let's give another generation these stories. This prayer room, that was on 45th Street right there. These guys did their gatherings in this building. Like, we love the legacy. Let's build it for another generation. So it is a half serious invitation.
One of the things that really inspires me is, you know, with increased mobility, for the most part, you know, we're in an exceptional year. I see so many young leaders relocating all the time to like join a mission. So that's what I wanted to underscore. Wow. I wanted to ask you this question, and it hasn't really come up in the context, but you know, when you look at your viewpoint, and I think this is an increasing issue in America and Canada and in the Western world, you would hold views on, you know, everything from one way to Jesus to sexuality to other things that would be very, very deeply countercultural to the ethos of New York City or even America. How do you advance the gospel when the message is so countercultural?
Well, here's what I know doesn't advance the gospel: watering the gospel down. It's like step one, don't water it down. So I believe there is power in the truth. And then when preached prayerfully and humbly, God does the work through it. So I'm trying to be faithful to the great tradition I've inherited, not accommodate to the spirit of the age. So, but how do you do it? I mean, there's a concept. I read this amazing book on the power of persuasion and communication. And this is something I've been talking about a lot. There's a concept called the sacred core. And every community possesses a non-negotiable at the center of it, where until it's acknowledged, you will not get any openness to respond. You have to acknowledge the sacred core of a community. So for the gay community, many gay people think, you know what Christians want? They want to pray the gay away. They want gay people to become straight. And so if you can acknowledge, I know that there's pain in your heart because you feel like in order for God to love and accept you, you have to become heterosexual. And I just want to say today, that's not true. The gospel is not a gospel of heterosexuality. Gay people must become straight. The gospel is the gospel of the lordship of Jesus. It has all sorts of implications. And but I want to acknowledge what it's like to grow up and to think, oh gosh, I feel about the same sex the way that my friends feel about the opposite sex. And then to go to bed every night hoping when you pray to wake up and it be gone and then it not be gone. And then to be terrified to tell your youth pastor and then to look at gay porn and then feel like you're in an even deeper cycle. And then, I just can't imagine all of that. And then to show up in church and hear that your pastor's going to be speaking on Jesus in the gay community. Gosh, you must carry so much like anxiety and fear of being dismissed and judged. And so that's how I opened my talk on Jesus in the gay community. I have several gay friends and they came up to me and said, I totally disagreed with your talk, but I felt like you understood what I'd been through. And so I was willing to listen. And you did challenge me on a few points I hadn't thought through. Now I disagree, but thank you for acknowledging you understand my journey. So again, that's not... That's around persuasion. And so in this book, they basically said there's three kinds of conversation. There's prophetic, there's pastoral, and there's persuasion. And the church has predominantly, particularly on moral issues, had the prophetic tone. Personally, the pastoral, but we haven't even had persuasion in our framework. And I think that in order for the church to get a larger hearing, we have to start with persuasion, then the pastoral, and end with the prophetic, particularly around morality and issues of justice. You probably need to start with the prophetic, and we're seeing that now. But particularly on issues of sexuality and other controversial issues, we need to say, how do I persuade? And Paul did this in Acts 17. He starts very, very far away from repent. You're wrong. He starts with, hey, you guys are spiritual. I
see this. I see this in you.
Yeah. And there's a hunger in you that's leading you to something. It's what Keller calls our subversive fulfillment. You come up within their story and you give it a surprise alternative ending. And so I try and do that a lot in my preaching. So don't water it down. Understand the sacred core and then preach in a humble, loving tone. And so one other thing I would say, when I first moved to New York, I was doing a tour of Christian leaders just saying, what advice do you have for me? I'm a new pastor. And one guy, Stan Oakes, said to me as a college professor, I said, give me what I need to know about pastoring in New York. And he said this, it was an amazing meeting. He said, woe to you when all men speak well of you. That was Jesus. And that was the meeting. And they're like, I was like, okay, man, I got it. So you got to break the fear of being liked. They crucified Jesus. They crucified him. If your desire is to be liked, forget it. Forget it. There's no way you can present the truth, no matter how skillful you are, in a way that it does not spark riots and create controversy. That's what it's done all over the world through history. Don't be an idiot about it. Don't be unsensitive, but you've got to break that fear of being liked.
Good word. John, you got a brand new book. I admire your writing discipline and schedule. You pump them out with, and they're deep. I mean, they're not like, oh yeah, here's a sermon that I had a ghostwriter turn into a book. But it's called The Beautiful Resistance. And in it, I'd love to know, let's just start with this. What's it about? Why did you write it? And then I've got one or two specific questions for you as we wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, I was reading, so why did I write it? I wrote it because I was heartbroken at the ways the culture was winning the war of discipleship over the church. People were being formed into the image of the world to a larger extent than Christians were being formed into the image of Jesus. And that was like breaking my heart pastorally. Several things happened in my congregation that I was like, I felt like, as Paul says, I was in the pains of childbirth. Like, Jesus has got to be formed. So I'm reading a biography of Bonhoeffer by Charles Marsh, I think called Strange Glory. And he has this scene in Bonhoeffer's life where Bonhoeffer's running Finkenwald, his seminary. And, Bonhoeffer's like in it, super intense. And his friend is concerned that it's too intense. There's what he calls so much spiritualism. And he basically comes to visit Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer takes him on a rowing trip across a river to where Hitler is training troops. He stands on the banks of the river and points to where Hitler's training troops, talks about his seminary, where he wrote Life Together and Cost of Discipleship. And he basically said, to summarize the conversation, what we're doing at the seminary has to be stronger than that, what Hitler's doing forming his army. We have to raise up a generation of Christians whose formation is stronger than that of the Third Reich. And then they row back. And I was like, gosh, that's the moment. It's a prophetic image. Here's what he's up against, and here's what he's working on, a little ragtag group of disciples. So who won? The seminary was shut down. Half the leaders signed allegiance to Hitler. Bunch of them were arrested. Fast forward 70 years. Bonhoeffer's a hero. His books have changed the lives and inspired millions. The German church is deeply repentant. Germany's paid billions in reparations to Israel. There's shame in the culture about what they went through.
A deep shame, having spent time in Germany, a deep shame. Yeah.
Yeah. So it worked. His formation was stronger. So it's about potency, not size. It's about potency. So I was so seized by that. It made me start asking the questions, what are the Christian practices that actually change people, that actually do the job of formation? And so I tried to pick out some of the most neglected and potent ones and preach on these. So when I was putting the book together and I had a few friends read it, they were like, the concept's really clear, but the practices are kind of disjointed. It doesn't flow beautifully like celebration of discipline, where there's 3 kinds of disciplines in quadrants. And I was like, yeah, because I try to pick the potent ones we're not good at, where we're failing. So
what are some of those disciplines, Jon?
So fasting, always a popular one. I hate fasting. It's probably the most transformative discipline in my life. What it means to honor people in a culture of contempt. So what is the practice of honor and how is there potency in that? What it means to agape love someone in a culture in cancel culture. What does it really mean to live in that? What does it mean to celebrate in the midst of cynicism? Why is defiant joy something that Christians have to fight for? Hospitality, how do we create portals of belonging in a culture where everybody is turning everyone into the other and pushing them away out of fear? And I feel like all of those things, when done, catalyze something in the spirit that shakes us and wakes us with a confrontation that has the power to produce change. So there's a few others in there, but
that's like I told you, I haven't got my hands on it, but I can't wait until I do. I would love to ask you about rest. So leaders, when they hear this, are somewhere, I don't know exactly when it's going to air, in the summer of 2020, or perhaps much later. They're listening to it a year or two down the road. People are tired like I've never seen, kind of exhausted, fatigued. It's Levi Lusko was on this show and he said, it's like we finished running the race and we thought, oh, great. And then someone handed us a bicycle and we realized, oh, this is a triathlon. Oh, and by the way, there's a swim afterwards. You've thought an awful lot about spiritual formation, about rest, about rhythms that renew us for the long haul. And you're now a COVID survivor. So you got that, right? What would you say to leaders who are just really tired and they're like, Jon, I don't know that I can do this much longer. What would you say to them?
Unless you do something different, you won't.
Yeah.
That's the truth. One thing, I don't know if Keller said this to you. I don't know where I heard it. I just heard it from Keller. He was talking about his response after 9/11, and he said a bunch of his staff and team jumped in and just ground it out in a heroic response.
That was on the show. We'll link to it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. And 18 months later or whatever, a ton of those people were gone.
Yeah.
They just burned out. And what I would say is you've got to. So here's what I would say. What we're dealing with is a replenishment problem right now. And because we've experienced disproportionate exhaustion, we're not going to be able to just use our regular rhythms of rest to acknowledge it. You're going to have disproportionate replenishment things. And they often feel trivial in the midst of so much crisis. And you can often feel guilty doing them. So you've got to, it's all the classic like drains and gains, but they feel like a luxury, which is like, how can I read poetry and go for a 2-hour walk when people in my congregation are dying? And it's like, you will be dying if you just let adrenaline burn your life out. So you've got to find those life-giving practices and you have to level them up. So you've got to reevaluate your foundational ones that sustain you in normal ministry, and then you've got to match new ones for this current season of ministry. And if you don't do that, you're going to be toast. So it's so interesting. People have said, like, isn't, COVID's a forced Sabbath? I'm like, I've never, since Easter, something happened at Easter where I've never worked so hard in my life since Easter. I mean, I am just pulling monster hours. And I'm also pulling monster rest. And I just realized I've taken real criticism. I've taken real criticism from people. And my response is, I understand that. I've been here 15 years, and I'm genuinely asking God for grace to put another 25 in. And so what you can count on is my faithfulness and my dependence, and I'm giving you all I can, trust me. And so that's why I've definitely practiced the Sabbath. I've been very intentional, new rhythms in the mornings and the evenings. To be honest with you, the number one thing I've experienced is mental exhaustion.
Yeah. It's funny because my physical rhythms are good right now. Like I'm getting enough sleep, I'm taking time off. But I was saying to my team this week, like, I'm just mentally tired. I feel like I'm contented out. And I have all these ideas. It's not like I'm out of ideas. It's just like the energy to produce them is lower. And I've been thinking, it's not just time off. Time off's really important. Like take your summer break, whatever you need to do. But it's really about time on and how we spend our time on. And if this season is unprecedented, we probably need some unprecedented rhythms and renewals that are going to take us. What have been a few things that have kept you, from burning out or in the game so far, as you say, after Easter, having worked harder than you ever have? Like what?
Yeah, I mean, filling the heart with beauty. That's been something that's huge. I love poetry. Looking at tons of nature photography, listening to jazz music on vinyl with headphones on, leaning back in a chair. I'm trying to remember the world is not just a broken crisis, that there is grace and beauty in the midst of it too. And Satan, Jesus says to Peter, Satan is coming after you. He's asked to sift you, but I've prayed for you that your faith won't fail. And that word eclipse, or to eclipse in the Greek, means Satan's asking to put something in front of you that blocks me out. To eclipse.
My
presence. Yes, to eclipse my presence. So I've just every day pushed the block back. Where is God? Look at my, people are dying. The world is broken. We're going to enter into like the greatest crisis of our generation. And then I just poke through the clouds and say, the Lord is good. Look at this. So that like beauty is a form of resistance against the brokenness of the world. We've got to fill our hearts. The other thing I would say that's like, it seems very, very small. I talked about this in my last book, and it's actually from Neil Postman, but he talks about liars, what he calls the low information to action ratio. And my definition is we know everything about that which we can do nothing about, and almost nothing about that which we can do everything about.
Yes.
And so you know about the Wuhan virus. Had you heard of Wuhan, China? Maybe you had.
I'd never heard of it. No.
Yeah. So I can tell you about, COVID rates in Wuhan. I can tell you about Korean cell phone tracking. I can tell you about the global economy. I can tell you about how, the British Prime Minister is doing. But do I know my actual neighbors' names? So I'm giving my attention to that which I actually have no agency in. And so I've tried to take action where I have agency. So it is like paying attention to who's around me, because that's how you actually repair the world. Very few people will be given the cultural influence and power to actually shape history. But all of us have unlimited agency to shape the world around us. And so I've tried to do tangible practices of care and love for my neighbors in ways that actually extend God's kingdom in a tangible way. And that's honestly kept me sane. It's kept me sane. So I think there's great value in asking, what beautiful and kind restorative thing can I do for someone around me? You know, what I'm about to say, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but people are talking about reparations, like for the African American community, and I'm absolutely in favor of reparations, meaning we need a national moment of recognition and repentance and some sort of restoration. There's many smart people who've thought it out, but here's what I've tried to do. Here's what I can do. If there's such a thing as microaggression, is it possible in a non-paternalistic way to do micro reparations? Like, is in my daily life, can I steward the privilege I have on behalf of others? And I try and do it in invisible ways so that it can't even be traced back to me. But I try and do small acts of kindness and love that address the brokenness of my world that I personally witness. And
can you give me an example? I know you're doing these quietly, but just hypothetically.
Well, I mean, not without losing my rewards in heaven, sending people money anonymously, you know, buying meals for people who can't pay you back and they don't know, encouragement, giving of gifts, talking to people, you know, the gift of time. One of the greatest encounters I had, I was in New York, praying early in the morning. And I've always been sort of an early morning person. And when I get up in the morning and walk around New York, there's two people who are up: investment bankers and homeless people. That's like who's walking around. And I was just saying, Jesus, show me where you are in this city. And this homeless woman came up to me and she said, "Hey, do you have any money?" And I said, "Look, I actually don't have any money." And she said, "Would you be willing to just talk to me then?" And I'm telling you, manifest presence of God. And he was like, "I'm here." And so I just had this amazing conversation about this woman's life. And at the end of it, she said this to me: "Thank you for being so kind to me." And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the kingdom of heaven. Like, I can't fix everything. I can't even fix her financial situation, but she felt heard and loved and seen. And I'm like, if I just have regular encounters like that, where I'm humanizing things and I'm honoring things in person, I don't know the ripple effects that will do. And again, small things with great love, Mother Teresa, but actually focusing on that as a way of responding to the meta global crisis.
It's a very affirming
It's been very
word.
important. Yeah.
That's a very affirming word. You know, it's interesting, John, having been grounded now for 3.5, 4 months as we record this. You know, you think, oh, we're really impacting the world. You're flying from city to city, speaking to leaders and, you know, participating in events and that kind of thing. But somehow I feel like I see the kingdom of God even a little bit closer, watching the birds in my backyard, talking to my neighbors, connecting with my parents every day, and just being a little slower and more present for the people I actually know in real life. It's been, I don't want to renormalize my life back to where it was before. And I loved it. And it was an incredible privilege, but this is somehow better. And
yeah, totally.
Trying to pay attention to that. Jon, this could go on 5 more hours. It's such a joy, as always. People want to connect with you. Tell us about social. Obviously, they can find the book Beautiful Resistance everywhere books are sold, but where can they find you online?
Our church's website is church.nyc. And I'm Jon Tyson on Instagram and Twitter. Yeah, just JONTYSON.
Yeah. Well, it won't be the last time. Jon, what a gift. Thank you, my friend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, man. I said this last time. You ask questions that get under the surface and get to the real issues. So I'm always really, really enjoy these conversations, and I'm very grateful to be on the show.
Likewise, and thanks for being willing to turn on the microphone for this one. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries, mate.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.